It is my delight to introduce our Honorary Secretary, Brian Kerr, who's going to read the minutes from the last meeting.
Thank you. Right. An ordinary meeting of the Royal Archaeological Institute was held in the rooms of the Society of Antiquaries of London on Wednesday, 11th December 2024 at 5 p.m. The President, Ms. Natalie Cohen, was in the chair. Ms. Lindsay Allison-Jones presented a paper on stone heads in the Roman military zone and what they tell us about people. Questions were asked by Martin Hennig, Chris Lockyer, Isabel Thompson, and Chris Spady Green, and the meeting ended at 6:15 p.m.
Are you happy that I sign the minutes as a record of the last meeting? Thank you. Okay, so it is my very great pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker. We have with us this evening for our first lecture of 2025, Professor Stephen Mythen from the University of Reading, who will be talking to us about Mesolithic archaeology this evening from the site at Rubha Port and Seilich. I've had to train myself to learn how to say that, and I've probably said it wrong already. But it is a great pleasure to be halfway through our lecture series for 2024-25 and to introduce a fantastic speaker to bring in the new year. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Stephen.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and let me immediately start by thanking the Royal Archaeological Institute for this kind invitation. I'm delighted to be able to talk to you about this excavation at Rubha Port and Seilich today. As you can see, this is a site on the east coast of the Isle of Islay. It doesn't always look quite as spectacular as this, but you can see the location of the site by the white marquee there, just on a terrace above the east coast. Now, the Mesolithic, to me, is the most fascinating period of British history. It's also one of the most neglected, unfortunately. It's squeezed between the end of the Paleolithic, the end of the Ice Age, that comes to an end around 11,500 years ago. Then we have, and as indicated by that line measuring global warming over the period, we then have a rapid increase in temperature, starts the Holocene period. And we have about 5,000 years of hunting and gathering by Mesolithic people in the forested and the wooded landscapes of Britain, before the arrival of Neolithic incomers, who ultimately displace the Mesolithic people, possibly with some interbreeding, some cultural exchange. And along the base there, we just have some of the classic stone artifacts that mark the presence of these different types of people. Hamburgian points are now found in Scotland, in northern Britain, at the site of Holborn. We have very problematic discussion about the Arensbergian, that's the very final Ice Age people, maybe start of the Holocene as well, with characteristic tang points. Then an early Mesolithic period, which is normally referred to as to Star Car, which is the classic site. And then throughout Britain, the later Mesolithic. Now in Scotland, Wauwerk, or northern Britain, prior to Rubha Port Seilich, there weren't any dated early Mesolithic sites. There are now, but there are plenty of later Mesolithic sites. Now I've always found the Mesolithic period really fascinating. This is a period of people hunting and gathering in the landscapes of forested landscapes of Britain. We don't know precisely when they arrived in Britain, whether there were descendants of the Paleolithic people here or new migrants into Britain. And of course, for much of the period, Britain was joined to the continent. They lived through periods of quite substantial climatic change, and they made very little impact on their environment. That's quite nice today because, we live in a time when we're all rather regretting the amount of impacts that we have made on the environment. So to deal with the people who lived for 5,000 years who left little trace of the presence, I find rather pleasant to explore. And then, of course, they were replaced by the incoming Neolithic farmers. They've received relatively little attention compared to the preceding Paleolithic, where you've got the exciting period of people living in Ice Age landscapes with reindeer and mammoth, or the following Neolithic. So I feel they've been neglected. And they've also too easily characterized by recently historically documented hunter-gatherers, with analogies drawn with African Bushmen or Canadian Inuit, which are most likely rather poor. And we do get very lovely imaginative images, such as this picture of a Mesolithic settlement, but the actual evidence for these is often very sparse. Now, by the Mesolithic experience in this lecture, I want to refer to two aspects. One, the experience of actually excavating a Mesolithic site, analysing its finds and interpreting the finds. Then also doing some experimental replication of Mesolithic activities. It is an experience quite unlike excavating other archaeological sites in Britain, because often you have to work very slowly, make meticulous recovery of the material, and often working in situations of very poor preservation of disturbed sites. When I take students up to Islay for my university to work, and they spend some of their time working on a medieval site with pickaxes and shovels, they come to my Mesolithic site with toothpicks and brushes, they find the contrast really, really striking. But the other aspect of the Mesolithic experience is how Mesolithic people experience their life. That's what we really want to find out about. We want to know what activities they undertook, the environments in which they lived, ideally how they thought about their landscapes, how they exploited it. And gradually, this site of Rubha Port and Seilich is providing us with some new evidence for that. The challenge of excavating the Mesolithic is that hunter-gatherers are highly mobile people. So excavating just one archaeological site tells you only a tiny bit about their lifestyles. Hunter-gatherers typically have dispersed settlement systems. In this schematic diagram, I've suggested winter base camps, spring base camps, summer base camps. These might be 10, 20, 50 kilometres apart or even more. And from those campsites, they go out to specialised locations for activities like fishing camps or places to acquire stone raw materials or places to particularly ambush or stalk large mammals. And these settlement systems can be spread across a whole landscape. So the challenge of trying to learn about the Mesolithic is you can't be content with just excavating one site. You've also got to excavate many. Now, I've been trying to do that in Western Scotland for about the past 30 years or so. I started working in this region of the Southern Hebrides in the late 1980s, building on work of others in the region, such as John Mercer, who worked on the Isle of Jura, very important amateur archaeologist, Paul Mellors, who worked on the Isle of Islay, and others who have worked in the region. And I've surveyed, explored, prospected, and then excavated possibly up to 10 Mesolithic sites in this region now. Some of them are clearly these site-specific sites. On the Isle of Coll, we excavated what must be a small fishing camp. It's next to a medieval fish trap, and there's fish bones from the site in a perfect fishing location. On Colonsay, we excavated a site with huge quantities of plant remains on a small island. Looks like intensive plant processing there. In the uplands and Islay at Stairs Neg, we've a small hunting camp. And what this has allowed us to do is to gradually build together that Mesolithic settlement system for Western Scotland. And I've got a diagram of it here that I must have made 10, maybe 15 years ago. And all the sites we excavate always have multiple occupation events there. And we've identified sites where they've got hunting camps, fishing camps, places for collecting pebbles, observation sites. But you know, the one site that was missing from this is a base camp. The sites where people go primarily for social activities, where they gather to share food or make tools, to tell stories, bring up their young and so forth. Those key locations of the landscape. And in 30 years of working on that, there was no site that I could interpret as a potential base camp at all. That caused me some frustration. And then in 2009, along came a discovery at Rubha Port and Seilich on the east coast of Islay. This Mesolithic site was found by pigs. The local estate, the Dunlost estate, the manager at that time had an idea that they could let pigs off foraging around the coast to try to remove the thick bracken that colonised and spread over it. It was a silly idea, it didn't work at all. But what the pigs did do, when they were snorting around on this particular terrace here, they turned over some little bits of flint. Now, fortunately, I knew the gamekeeper there quite well, Donald James McPhee, and he called me. I said, Steve, when you're next on the island, come and look at these bits of flint, because he knew I was working on Mesolithic sites on the island, and he also knew that we'd never, ever found anything on the east coast. So when I went up, I did indeed look at the flint, and they looked possibly Mesolithic. There were a few flakes, maybe blades there, nothing very much. But at a very interesting location. You can see the location there on the middle slide at the base. It's right on the east coast of Islay by the Sound of Islay. This is between Islay on one side and Jura on the other. And that is a key routeway through the islands today. It's where one of the main ferries goes down. And in fact, the main port of Port Ascaig, where the ferries come into, is just about 2 kilometres further down the sound. Well, that 2009, we embarked working at this site, and we finished our fieldwork there in 2023. In between, we were working at other sites. And this has involved quite a long time period of work. We began in 2009 by doing test pitting. There might have been hardly anything there other than a few flint flakes. You don't want to start investing time in an excavation until you've fully evaluated it. The test pitting looked promising, but was confusing because we couldn't understand the stratigraphy. So in 2013, we excavated along I forgot the cursor, yeah, this long slit trench right down the middle of the terrace here to expose the stratigraphy. That also looked promising, but we couldn't really identify where should we put a detailed trenching. So in 2017, we opened up a very large area. We just took the surface off the terrace to try to identify where would be the most valuable place to excavate. And that identified this 5 by 4 metre square here, very small area, 5 by 5 area square here, very small area, that then became our Trench 3, and which I'll mainly talk about the excavation today. You can see the site here. It's about 7 or 8 metres above the current sea level here. So it would always been above the maximum transgression of the higher sea level. Here we are test pitting 2009. We just put a sequence of them across the site. And we're delighted with what we found. You can see here in this test pit here, there's quite deep stratigraphy. Now, it doesn't look deep stratigraphy if you're used to urban sites or sites in lowlands. But for a highland site, to have up to 1 metre deep deposits was very striking. Not only that, there was very large quantities of chipped stone, mainly some of which was diagnostically later Mesolithic, as we can see here. We also had some calcined faunal remains. Now, animal bones are very rarely found in Scotland because of the peaty acidic soils. They just rot away. It's only really on shell middens where you find animal bones being preserved because of the calcium in the sand. But here, some bone had been burned at high temperatures, up to 70 degrees centigrade, and become calcined, and therefore it's preserved. Well, although there were small fragments, it was hugely valuable. And then in one of the test pits, we found this artifact down here. Now, this typologically, it can be classified as an Arisbergian-like tanged point. And there's been lots of debates about some of these in Scotland as to whether they indicate a late Upper Paleolithic presence there. This came out of the base of a test pit. It didn't have context. It didn't seem to relate to the other lithic material. It's quite a rolled and polished piece. So we're quite excited that this suggests there might be here some in situ late glacial activity. Well, that led us to do a long evaluation trench down the terrace. We did that because in each of the test pits, the stratigraphy seemed quite different. In some it was deep, some it was shallow, some were getting heavily burnt layers, in others bits of clay, so we didn't really understand it. So we did a long stratigraphic trench through it. And that confirmed nice stretch of deep stratigraphy, and it also gave us some well-preserved features. Particularly, we cut right through the middle of a fireplace here. So you can see this fireplace here, which was built up against a bit of bedrock here above the till and the glacial sands at the base. You can see it in the section here. And from the lower horizon, right at the base, we also got some quite large pieces of flint that could perhaps be associated with that Arnsbergian point. 2017, we decided we wanted to do a very fine-scale detailed excavation. But we wanted to make sure we're putting our trench in the right place because we knew it was going to take a lot of time. So we opened up a large area. Here we can see my students still cleaning the surface there. Right down the middle you can see our original evaluation trench of 2013. And in the base here, down at this area, clearly there had been a lot of erosion. We had lots of sediments. And at the top here, there were quite thick deposits of cluvium. But in the middle, we seemed to have a very good balance, and we had features emerging on the surface there. So we selected this area here, about 5 meters square, for our detailed excavation. What we weren't going to do was try to excavate the whole campsite. That would have just been too demanding. We wanted to do a very fine, stratigraphically controlled excavation to see if we could get a detailed chronology of the settlement at this place. So we selected that square in 2018 to start excavating. And we excavated the sediments down in 5 centimetre spits at most, sometimes finer, sometimes a little bit thicker, recording all artefacts, all sediments, or plant remains and so forth, to 50 centimetre square quadrats, although we were point finding a certain number of material. You can see there's the trench there. Now the whole campsite is at least that area, so just doing a little sample of what might be there. What we found makes me think there's a huge, many more structures and features at this site that needs investigating. So here you can see the excavation on that grid, going quite slowly down through the sediments here, and you can see that we're collecting every bit of soil into these sacks because we undertook 100% sieving through a 3mm mesh, or about 20% of our samples through 0.25 millimeters and up to 2 millimeters mesh. So we get 100% recovery of all the tiny artifacts, the animal bones, the plant remains. This was a huge part of the project. The excavating was at times much more quicker than doing this sieving. Either pumping up from a river, or in the end we had to use the sea because the rivers were too dried up. And then the student team had to do a meticulous sorting of residues. I think we had about 4,500 samples of residues that they've sorted over the time, carefully with tweezers picking out all the various artifacts. And this gave us really 4 different types of artifacts and ecofacts from the excavation. Huge quantities of chipped stone. Of course, most of that is the debris from making stone artifacts. A lot of coarse stone tools as well. These are pieces of pebbles that have either been worked or have been used as naturally found. Possibly up to about 5,000 fragments of animal bone, calcined. About 2% of it can be identified to species. And then huge amounts of plant remains. Charred hazelnut shells predominate, a lot of wood charcoal, probably other fruits and seeds. And you can see here the specialists I'm working with. I invited Dr. Inga Berg-Hansen from Oslo Museum to work on the chipped stone. Mainly because I was very interested in the earliest Mesolithic, the Megalomosian. She's a specialist of that, working in Norway. And my view is that the earliest occupants of northern Britain likely came across Doggerland from Scandinavia, and therefore were interested in looking at connections between the artefacts here and there. Ruth Shaffrey is a colleague at Reading. Dr. Ingrid Mainland is from University of Highlands and Islands, and Dr. Rosemary Bishop, who's mainly working on the plant material now, or will be, she recently has moved to Stavanger, and is probably the leading specialist on Mesolithic plant remains in Europe at the moment. So here we can see the excavation at the end of the 2018 season. So this is after 4 weeks excavation. You can see we've just gone down a tiny, tiny little way. Okay. On the vertical surface there, I'm putting some of these context numbers on because we'll later see them in a matrix. And as you can see, we're getting some bits of just flat stone here. Some of these we think, are deliberately positioned. Some of them have marks on. They're just scratches on from made in either Mesolithic times or possibly scratched by a plough, because we know that this little terrace was used for potatoes at some time in the 19th century. And you can see gradually this fireplace in section. And here's the distributions of animal bone fragments and chipstone artifacts on that surface. By recording them into the half-metre squares, we can then do these contour plots and see where they're concentrated in these small areas. So here we can see the stone artifacts and the bone fragments are very much concentrated away from what the fireplace is, and we think that's because the fireplace is a bit earlier. At the end of the 2019 season, we were finding our first features. A large shallow pit here at the back of the small trench, then a series of post holes and a gully round here. We think this may have been a possible windbreak. It would have worked well as a windbreak by a hearth there, although we're not entirely sure that the hearth may have gone out of use by that time. 2020 season, that was the COVID year, start and end of it. But when we got to the 21 season, we began getting down into clearly undisturbed deposits of quite a different nature. You can see in the little diagram at the top approximately where it had got to with our excavations. And here at the end of 2021, we're down into the early deposits, coming onto the top of the fireplace deposits. You can see the base of those post holes quite clearly here, and how now we've got huge quantities of charcoal, charred plant materials around the site, as well as a large stone-lined pit at the back that I'll mention in a moment. I think this was a midgie day. You can see these students excavating midges there. We don't get too many midges there because it's quite windy on the coast, but sometimes when it's still, you do get midgie days. And now the artifact and ecofact distributions have changed rather. Now you can see that the bone fragments and the chipstone fragments are much more concentrated around the front of the trench, and this is immediately behind this big fireplace here, possibly another fireplace, and then also heavy concentrations around this pit at the back. Here we are in the following year, 2022. You can see we're still going down very slowly with these spits. Here's this large stone-lined pit at the back, and the earlier shallow pits. And about midway through that field season, we had exposed that large fireplace and plan here, beautifully stone-built fireplace. Another possible fireplace, but a strange stone structure to the right of it. Nice stone platform there, and the stone-lined pit at the back. Now, I was conscious now that we'd got to 2022 after 3 years of excavation. We were keen to see what further stratigraphy we had to get through, because we wanted to make sure we could finish this trench in time. So what we chose to do was to excavate one strip of it in the end of that season, right down as far as we could go in that time to see the underlying horizons. And here we have Katie and Sam excavating that strip very carefully. We're piece plotting artifacts here, as well as recording them by grid square. And here you can see a nice scatter of these in situ Mesolithic artifacts sitting on the surface there, including tools and debris. And that's at the end of the season, where we've now, on this area, gone down to the bedrock and the wind-blown glacial sand above it. And here this was remaining for 2023 to excavate. So in 2023, we started by excavating these nice features. This stone-lined pit is fascinating. It's lined with stones all the way down. It's actually cut into the soft bedrock below it. It's got this demarcation. It's divided into two by this line of stones. We know there's large quantities of bone fragments and plant remains in it, but we've yet to actually analyse those. So whether it's a storage pit or a roasting pit, we're not entirely clear. Similarly, this feature here just resolved as a large number of stone blocks in a shallow pit with nice coarse stones with it, but not seeming to be burnt. So we're not quite clear what this feature is. I think this here is probably a platform for a large post. So I think some of this might have been covered at times. Of course, we've only got a small area. We might actually be internal to structure here that is covering a much larger area. And there's excavating the fireplace at the front. Now, these fireplaces are really important because fire is really important in hunter-gatherer settlements. It's quite surprising, actually, if you look at Mesolithic sites throughout Britain, the number of well-built fireplaces are quite sparse. In all the other Mesolithic sites I've excavated in Western Scotland, there's only one, site of Credu on the Isle of Mull, where we've got large stone-built fireplaces. Elsewhere, they tend to be just really rather ephemeral patches of burnt soil or scatters of charcoal. But here they're clearly building substantial structures. For hunter-gatherers, fire was critical. It provided warmth. It provided light, extending the day. It provided opportunity to cook food and to transform materials, whether it was preparing resin or hardening wooden points. But most importantly, what hunter-gatherers do around fireplaces is they tell stories. They socialise, they culture children and other people into their way of thinking about the world. Often they conjure up the spirits from the flames and the smoke. And I suspect all of that is happening at this location. These are the largest fireplaces we've found in my work in the Mesolithic, although John Mercer did actually find very similar fireplaces back in the 1970s on the Isle of Jura, which hadn't received a great deal of notice. And then here's excavating the earliest activity at the site, which is away from the fireplace. We're now down in the shelter of this bedrock here, and again you can see these in situ artifacts on the surface. And then once we've got down to the natural here, and you can see we're no more than probably 75 centimetres, a metre at most, down onto this bedrock, and embedded around that is a wind-blown glacial sand that our geologist colleague tells us is likely from the Younger Dryas. So that's probably 12,500 years ago. And then we've got settlement directly on top of that, the date of which remains slightly unclear. So that slow excavation over a number of years allowed us to make quite a detailed stratigraphic matrix of these are the main These are just the main contexts going down through that metre at most. And here these contexts are put into stratigraphic blocks, block 1 to block 8. So what's happening at this site is, because it's on this nice flat terrace there, we've got hunter-gatherers intermittently coming here, maybe just for a few weeks, maybe for a few months, then they're leaving again. They might be coming back next year, they might be coming back in a few weeks, or they might be leaving it for several years. And while they're away, we've got colluvium eroding down from above the site, burying their artifacts, and then they come and make another activity on top of that. So we've got a gradual, slow accumulation of sediment and activities, which means that we've actually got a stratigraphic sequence, even in this small deposit. Now, we now have 36 radiocarbon dates through that sequence, which is a substantial number for a Mesolithic site, especially for a 5 by 5 metre trench. The majority of them are in nice stratigraphic order, which is quite surprising if you think about the amount of trampling and bioturbation that would have gone on the site. And these tell us that the activity at Rubha Port and Seilich, well, the upper horizons date this. I've put the dates into 4 phases. We think we've got 4 good phases here. The last phase dates to between 8,000 and 6,000 years ago. So that broadly takes us up to the start of the Mesolithic. That's a time when, that takes up to the end of the Mesolithic. We then have what we think is a 200-year hiatus when there's no activity here. And then we have a phase 3 between about 8,400 and 8,200 with these contexts. And then a phase 2 between at least 9,000 and 8,500 years ago. Now, these might well merge into each other, but I think we've got distinct difference in technology between this phase 3 and phase 2 here. You can see the dates, some of the dates here are not in stratigraphic order. So we've got dates of, in uncalibrated, 7,900 here, and yet 7,600 below that. I think what's happening here is this is the time of those fireplaces. So they're periodically cleaning out the fireplaces, and we're getting ash and charcoal thrown on top of more recent deposits, which gives us inverted stratigraphy. At the end of that phase, we seem to have a gap of 1,000 years with no activity at the site. And prior to that, we've got a set of dates that gives us activity between 10.4 and 10.2 thousand years ago. So that takes us back into the early Mesolithic. Now, almost all these dates are on charred pieces of hazelnut shell. That's the best thing to radiocarbon date, because we know those are just 1 year old. Dating pieces of wood is problematic because they might be old wood. The wood might already be several hundred years old before you actually date it. That, however, does create problems, because hazel, before this project, had only been thought to be present in Western Scotland by about 9,500 years ago. Now, here we've clearly dated it to almost 10,500 years ago. But in these very basal deposits, we don't have charred hazelnut shells. We've got very few pieces of wood. So I'm still not sure whether the earliest dates down here, that we haven't managed to date very well, are actually accurate. And I suspect these might go back another 500 years, if not more. And I've got to find another way of dating that at the moment. But anyway, we've got a fabulous chronological sequence here. This is the first time the early Mesolithic has actually been dated in Scotland, or northern Britain, I should say, when it's actually been found in situ, and in a stratigraphic sequence with the later Mesolithic. This 1,000-year hiatus gave us a bit of a surprise. We don't really see the evidence for that in the stratigraphy. I still wonder whether we have a dating issue there. But where we're currently looking at the moment is we've got the activity of Rubha Port Seilich extends over this period. We've got that early period there. We've got this 1,000-year hiatus. We've got those phase 3 and 2 here with with the main building of these fires. We've got a 200-year hiatus here, and then we have ongoing occupation until the start of the Neolithic. Now note that 200-year gap there coincides with this little dip in temperature here. This is known as the 8.2 event. It's 100 or 200 years of really cold weather. And we think that that's a time when Mesolithic people left Western Scotland, or their population fell substantially. And they seem to be absent from Rubha Port and Seilich at that time. Whether we have earlier occupation, I think the case is still out. My colleague, Inga, she thinks that this Arensbergian point is just part of the early Mesolithic, because that's what you find in Scandinavia. So she thinks it's part of the Maglemosian. We're just not sure. So let's look at some of the chipstone from the site. The chipstone comes in what we would call waste and tools. They're using flint pebbles mainly as their raw material, and these are being knapped to remove large blades and flakes and the smaller blades. We have the discarded cores thrown away, and then some of these blades and flakes are then turned into what we call microliths by removing the bulb end, the proximal end, and then chipping them into a range of different shapes. These tend to be later Mesolithic, and here we've got isosceles triangles from the earlier Mesolithic. They also make scrapers using on either blades or flakes where they're chipping around the edge with a rather robust edge. They have some other use of stones. We've got pitch stone on the site. That's coming from the Isle of Arran, which is perhaps about 30 kilometres away, but across a sea journey. And we've got fine rock crystal being made, almost translucent. Not sure where that's coming from. They're using some of that. Now, of course, all these are just components of tools. They would have been used as, they would have been hafted, like these replica arrows, knives. They may have been used in grating boards, in knife blades, and so forth. Now, these pebbles are probably coming from Islay itself, I think, because in previous projects, we've surveyed all the west coast of Scotland looking for sources of flint. And the most abundant source you find is on the west coast of Islay. That's because the original Cretaceous deposits are off in the Irish Sea, and this is where they're getting washed up to. So if you go to these beaches on the west coast, such as here, you can pick up flint pebbles. And I suspect that's where they're going to find them. And they're transporting them round either just gradually or possibly even in their boats coming around the north tip of Islay here. And I must admit I was really surprised to find such vast quantities of flint on this coast, because most of the Mesolithic sites we find are on this side here. Now, Will Attard, who works with me, he's an expert flint napper, so he's been replicating some of the technology. We are making very detailed studies of the chipstone assemblages. You can see here from our 4 phases how the size of the blades just gradually gets smaller through time. I say gradually, we think it's gradually. There might be a bit of a jump here. That's phase 4. We can see the blades are quite long. Shortened phase 3. We've not analysed shortened phase 2. We've not analysed the data from phase 3 yet. And phase 4, they're quite short. Now, in that phase 1, the very basic levels, you can see we've got the longest blades of all, which is why that makes me think these are possibly earlier than the dates we have at the moment. And the cores become shorter and wider. They change how they're working these pebbles. In the earlier period, they're working them longitudinally to take off long, thin blades. And in the later periods, they sort of turn them on their edge to become shorter and fatter core to remove smaller blades. And again, this change seems to happen after phase 2. So we've got different aspects of technology changing at different times. Regarding the tools themselves, in these early periods, we've got very much a predominance of scrapers such as these here, 45% of these, of 218 tools we have, but just under 40% of microliths. And then through time, scrapers become less used, much more interested in making microliths. This must imply some change of activities at the site because of making different toolkits. I'm not quite sure what those change of activities are yet. And again, looking at, it looks like we've got a very significant change in activity between phase 1 and phase 2 when it all remains similar, even though the technology is changing at a different rate. And then the types of microliths change as well. So right here at the base, we've got typical early Mesolithic lancets or obliquely retouched points, isosceles triangles. Then they gradually disappear, and we end up with the typical scaling triangles or back bladelets of the later Mesolithic. So we're getting nice sequences of technical change through time. Similarly, with the coarse stone tools, these have been really neglected on Mesolithic sites, I think. They're very interesting components of the technology. They come at Rubha Port and Seilich, they come in either longitudinal shapes, elongated shapes, or spherical ones, either a sphere or a disc, and then some amorphous ones, and we have some flakes there. Now, these are also probably being collected on the beaches from Islay. Last December, when I was in Ireland, I went out to these beaches at Sandingmore here and at Kilkerran here. These are Flint Ridge beaches. And here you find, these are just natural pebbles from the beach, very similar to shapes and sizes that you find on the site itself. Whereas at Rubha Port and Seilich, the different wave actions and so forth, you find much more angular pebbles. And these elongated forms at the site, they come in various different shapes and sizes, some of which I think are probably being collected locally with Rubha Port and Seilich, and others I'm sure are being collected from those west coast beaches. Now, quite a few of these have use traces on. This is an amazing, polished, long, thin piece of pebble with long striations going longitudinally and a heavily polished end. We don't know what these are used for. We need to do some experimental work to find out. This coarse piece has a very heavily beveled end here. We have a few of these with detached flakes, probably used for hammering. These are sometimes described as limpet hammers when you're removing limpets from rock and sometimes remove a flake. Although they could have been used for working flint cobbles. Some very small pieces with heavily polished and beveled ends, and some just circular hammerstones with battered ends. Then we also have some other large slabs of stones on the site, rubbing stones. These are very rare on Mesolithic sites, not found these anywhere else in the Hebrides. So these are more typical of Neolithic sites where you find them polishing axes. So we've got here where this stone has been very ground down by some rubbing, whether it's rubbing stone or wood or what, we're not sure. Similarly, this one with a nice concave surface, and these have got these rub grooves on. These are large bits of stone that was stationary flat on the site as part of the site furniture. Interesting, through the phases, there's consistent frequencies of these coarse stone tools. You can see the frequencies of elongated stone tools is pretty consistent throughout, as are the circular ones. So they seem to be doing the same activity with these stone tools throughout the time period. Now, the animal bones, these remain under study. I've been waiting for my final report from our faunal specialist for quite a long time. There's many thousands of fragments to analyse. About 1% can be identified. They're all heavily burned. The 2018 sample, we've identified red deer, roe deer, wild boar, the typical Mesolithic animals there. There's some fish bones, but very few, surprisingly for a coastal site. Now that might be because they're just not being preserved, because in the burning they're not preserved. I doubt that, however, because some fish vertebrae can be very large. And we've got very small fish bones preserved at other sites. So I suspect there's not much fishing going on. Possibly it was used as raw material for fuel. Maybe that's why they got burned. Possibly they're being burned in times of ritual. It's really, really unclear at the moment. And the plant remains, these have also yet to be studied. We've only recently finished actually sorting the flotations. We've got huge quantities of these. They fall into three key classes. There's hazelnut shell, which are unlikely other seeds and fruits. There's wood charcoal, and we know that that's giving us a sample of the trees in the environment. And parenchyma, this is the fleshy bits of plant material that have been charred. So we can guess this was probably being used for food, for fuel, for medicines, for raw materials, for tools, baskets of clothing. But we've got a wonderful sample from the early and late Mesolithic yet to be analysed, which is one of the next tasks we have to do. Indeed, that takes me to future work on the site. The key task is I've got to raise a grant and funds to undertake those analysis of the plant remains. I think there's a wonderful opportunity here to do that. And also geochemical analysis of the sediments. We've been trying to extract ancient sedimentary DNA out of sediments with a team from Aberdeen. I'm still waiting for their outcomes. They thought they were identifying archaic DNA, but they've gone quiet at me for the last 2 or 3 months, so I've got to chase it up. We also want to conduct a substantial experimental archaeology study to interpret those stone artifacts and the plant remains and the stone line features. Yet to complete the excavation report, and then hopefully within 2 or 3 years we'll go to full publication. Now let me summarise by just talking what I think is happening at Rubha Port and Seilich. When I started, I talked about the challenge of Mesolithic archaeology because you've got to look at a whole settlement system. And I explained that in my work up until 2009 or so, I thought we'd found lots of the task-specific sites, the specialist campsites. Well, I think Rubha Port and Seilich is probably one of these missing base camps. I do that because of the density of material on the site, the diversity of material. That site furniture, those big rubbing stones, the large fireplaces, and I suspect living structures that were constructed there that we've not really been able to see in our small trench. And also the location of Rubha Port and Seilich is at this really key place here, which gives it, I describe as a gateway site to these islands. It's a gateway. I don't think it's insignificant. This is where the modern day ferry comes down and drops people here. This site here gives you access to the large landscapes of Islay and Jura for hunting land mammals, accessing flint resources, gathering in the woodlands. It also gives you access to the smaller islands, not only Oronsay and Colonsay, where we know they were collecting shells and intensive plant remains, but also up to the island of Mull and out to Colon-Tyree. So I think Rubha Port Seilich is a gateway location for the Mesolithic in this area and an important base camp which people came back to again and again and again. Where did the people come from? Well, with the 2 phases, we don't know whether we've got the same population or different populations. I suspect that the earlier phase, people are coming from the east, coming across Doggerland and coming into Scotland that way. The second phase may have been a total new migration coming into the area because it comes in coinciding when Doggerland is becoming flooded, and there may have been people moving to the landscape again with a new technology. We've got to further explore this by doing further work on these stone tools. I was a bit disparaging about this figure at first, saying, oh, that's a bit imaginative, really. But actually, I think it's not a bad impression of probably what Rubha Port and Seilich is like, because we've got the remains for a variety of tools, for bones, including a few fish bones, for large fireplaces. I suspect the charred hazelnut shells were partly being used on those fires to smoke the fish. So I think it was probably a bit of a campsite like that. But with our small trench, we're never going to be able to actually excavate the full features. And that really brings me to the end now. That's where I've got to in this project. We've got that feature work to do, and it just leaves me to thank my team. Will Attard and Sarah Lambert-Gates have been the main supervisors of the excavation, and Rory Williams-Burrell there, he supervised all of that mass amount of sieving and sorting. I've had many, many students there. Here, right at the end, down on the sterile soil, they're having a little bit of a Mesolithic experience there, having some venison cooked over open fire, which had been butchered by Will with the flint tools he'd made from a bit of a deer carcass we had access to. And you could also see some of the plant materials there that we're eating as well. And of course, I've got to thank the funders, the people who have kindly supported this project, the University of Reading for many years of institutional support, the Royal Archaeological Institute for their 3 years of funding, which has been absolutely essential to complete the excavation, and the Society of Antiquaries of London and Scotland, and the charity in Islay, Islay Heritage, which supports archaeological work in the island. So it's with that thanks to those people, and thank you to you for listening. And I hope you will follow the excavation, the report, as we find out what's in these plant remains, animal bones, and move to our final report. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stephen. That was absolutely fascinating. I don't believe I've ever heard of a site that has been discovered by pigs before.
Yeah.
And as promised, there was not a single cloudy day photo. So obviously, the
No
weather
rain,
is always this beautiful on the island. Do we have any questions for our speaker this evening? I'll come to Elizabeth first and then come back.
Thank you very much. I have lots of questions, but I'll confine myself to two brief ones, if I may. They may not be brief in answer. The first one is, you show your pictures of the coastline of the islands looking quite like it does today. What was it like in the Mesolithic? And is the site that you were excavating actually that close to the sea, or is it actually further away? What difference does the sea level make?
Not a great deal. So in the possibly in the earliest period of occupation, the sea level was a bit lower, okay. But at the maximum transgression of about 6,500, the sea level probably only got up to about 5 or 6 meters higher than it is today. So the site was never actually flooded, okay. But the water was probably lapping up against it, okay. Now we have struggled with this because, interestingly, within the flint assemblage, we occasionally find some really heavily rolled pieces. And they're quite strange because they're plonked in with really fresh stone. Now, if the site had been flooded, we'd expect to get much more rolled pieces. Would expect to get evidence for spreads of gravel across it. There's no evidence that it was ever actually inundated. But suggests people were actually living much closer to the sea than it is today since it's fallen down. I'm sure that part of the attraction to the site, whether the sea level was a bit higher, a bit lower as it is today, is this outcrop here. Because it provides fantastic harbouring, it's coming around in a kayak or canoe from both the north and the south. And in fact, we've been there and watched people kayaking around the island, and this is a natural place for them to come in. There's also a fantastic fishing place down here. It's where many of the local fishermen have put their lots of pots. I'm still down here. We also regularly see sea nuns down here, lots of seals, basking sharks, and otter used to have hops around here. So fantastic aquatic resources here. So sure, the sea was important. And of course, the sea was also a highways for these people. The landscape would be much more wooded than today. So it is a coastal site. And the change of sea level probably didn't make a great deal of difference to it. And Islay was always a coastal site, so they've always had to use boats together.
Thank you. Can I ask another one? Thank you. I wondered if you had any micro-environmental evidence from the site that showed what it was like, whether it was had the same sort of environment across the long period that you've been looking at.
We're going to
stop now.
We're going to get that. We're going to get that from the sediments that we have, where we're going to be able to extract phytoliths and pollen and so forth. We can do some of it from our macro wood charcoal. We've already, from the upper layers, we've got typical mixed oak, woodland oak, and so forth. We've got to see how that changes down through the sequence. So this is work that we need to do. And I'm waiting on the bone report as well to see whether we can see any changes in the form there. So that environmental reconstruction is really the next phase of the project. It's quite expensive to do because you start using lots of scientific techniques. So what I've got to do in 2025 is raise the funds for those. But we've got a wonderful opportunity because we've got complete columns down through that sediment, going from about 10,500 at the base to about 6,000 on top of a continuous sequence. And we want to also use that to check this 1,000-year hiatus, which we couldn't see in the stratigraphy we were excavating. It was only come up by the radiocarbon dates. So I'm a bit surprised at that, and I'm still a little bit uneasy about it.
You've just been asked my two questions, so I'm going to ask
okay.
a third.
Have you got another? Right.
I wanted to know about the coastline too, particularly.
Yes.
So can I ask a third question, which is, you just touched on the other sites on, say, Mull and other areas like that. Can you say just a little bit about how much they are the same period? Just a little bit more.
Yeah, I can do. Just a little bit. So let's just find that slide. Yeah, it's only in November time that I got the final dates from Rubha Port and Seilich. And at this moment, we've got a little project doing a much more detailed analysis of those dates using Bayesian modelling to tie it down more. But we know, for instance, that on Mull, at this site, Credu, which we excavated in 2012, we've also got possibly remains of structures of fireplaces, and we've got radiocarbon dates there, which also go back to about 10,400. So that seems to be contemporary with the earliest phase here. But then we don't really have any other sites until we get to about 9,000 here, which is the Fiskery on the Isle of Coll. And then we have a whole number of sites that are overlapping with that, what I call the phase 3 activity, between about 9,000 and about 8,200. So I think, as far as we can say, these sites are going to be contemporary, as far as we're going to be able to do it. We might do better with a bit more modelling. The dilemma is, so often Mesolithic sites just been dated by 1 or 2 radiocarbon dates. You say the date is that. If you get 10 radiocarbon dates, they tend to show there's lots of different activities there. So the overall chronology for Western Scotland, well, it's probably better than anywhere else in Britain, but it's still not quite as good as we want. What is exciting, though, is going back to John Mercer's excavations in Jura. Because in the late 70s and 1980s, he excavated what he said were early Mesolithic sites there. He didn't have good chipped stone. He had some rather poor, but he also found big stone-lined features, just as we've got at Rubha Port and Seilich. So it's fantastic finding those, because it was rather validate what he found, but couldn't really date or report terribly well. So I think we can do more of trying to reconstruct these settlement patterns. For instance, at Fiskery Bay here, clearly a fishing site. We've got nice fishing bones there. We can see with the chip stone there, they don't have any pebbles there, any of the outside, or many of the outside flakes of the pebbles. So we think they're taking partially worked cores to the little Isle of Coll, which takes a long time to get. I mean, that's about a 3-hour crossing in a kayak. It's a really brave thing to do in those little boats, to go out in that seawater. So as much as we can, we want to link these together into this settlement pattern. But we've got to work on our chronology roof, refine that, and then embed all these other sites into it, which is another project we need to do as part of the write-up. But it's a great opportunity to actually look at Mesolithic sediment across the landscape. And as I say, when I embarked on this project in the late 1980s, what I wanted to do was excavate a number of sites using exactly the same excavation methods, and as far as I can, the same team, so we can make good comparisons between the sites confidently. And we've achieved that.
I'd just like to ask a couple of questions related to population, because you mentioned there was very little trace on the environment.
Yeah.
Is it possible at all to estimate, say, a UK population of the Mesolithic in any meaningful sense, or is that
personally, I don't really think so. I think it's extremely difficult. I mean, obviously we can take analogies with modern hunter-gatherers, and if you took historically documented hunter-gatherers, they're of living in sort of boreal woodland, temperate woodland, similar to what we think would have happened here. These would be looking at people in Tierra del Fuego or North America. You'd have a region of this area with a population of perhaps 200 or 300 people at most. Okay. I think in Britain you're dealing with, I think parts of the landscape were actually unoccupied for long periods of the time. So I don't think you've ever got very dense populations. You've got mobile hunter-gatherers. And I suspect they're living in population groups that amount to about 250, 500 people as a breeding population, covering probably much of the west coast of Scotland or most of northern Britain, which then separates into smaller residential groups of between 50 and 100 people, who then fish in infusion. But that's just doing analogies from modern hunter-gatherers, very limited ways that we can try to infer past populations.
Okay, thanks.
It's unfortunate.
Yeah. And just secondly, what do you think happened to the people you were studying when the Neolithic came along?
Yeah, well, that's a really, really interesting question. Really interesting question. You know, for many years, archaeologists debated whether the Mesolithic people in Britain became Neolithic. They just adopted Neolithic methods of farming. They learnt about these, adopted, or whether the population was replaced by incoming Neolithic people. Well, in 2019, when we had the first substantial evidence from DNA from Neolithic and small sample of skeletal material, it showed quite clearly that the Neolithic people had different genetic variants to those of the Mesolithic people. And an argument came that the Mesolithic people were simply replaced. By which they mean the Neolithic people were exploiting the landscape more effectively, and the Mesolithic people just dwindled and went into extinction. There is, however, one tweak on that, because around Oban here, 2 skeletons were found that were clearly evidence of interbreeding of Mesolithic and Neolithic people. And my own view is that in Western Scotland, the population is actually blended rather, because I think we find Mesolithic microliths continuing in Neolithic technology quite late, and we've got more of an overlap of Mesolithic dates and Neolithic dates. So in an article I published in Proceeding Prehistoric Society a number of years ago, I referred to this as the Meso-Neolithic period, or the Neo-Meso period. And I think you've got actually blended populations up here rather than just a replacement. I think you may have had a replacement in southern Britain, in England, but here I'm sure that there was an overlap and a blending with the Neolithic people needing to draw on the knowledge of the hunter-gatherers to be able to exploit these landscapes. This was indigenous knowledge that they needed to know. It was not suitable for their types of farming. And I think after a number of years, the Neolithic people actually began hunting, gathering up here much more using the Mesolithic methods. That's a bit of speculation, but that's my view of the interaction.
Thank you.
Hi. You mentioned the fossil remains were pretty slim, and you touched upon large mammals and fish. Is there any evidence of smaller mammals, particularly fur-bearing animals, and kind of clothing production?
Not that I know of yet. I think there may have, one of the, we had a sample analysed in 2018. There were some bird bones in there. There were some fish bones in there. And there was a claimed badger bone in there. Now, badgers aren't found on Islay today, and I'm not sure what the distribution of they may have been like, but it was a claimed badger. Maybe it's misidentification, I'm not sure. I'm waiting for my final bone report, and I think she's going to do a very good job. She's suggesting that for the larger mammals, we do seem to have many body parts present. So they are actually killing whole animals and butchering them and processing them at the site. You're right, the microfauna, the small fauna, has as much interest as the larger ones. So I'm just keeping my fingers crossed that there'll be something interesting in that.
Just a question about the fishing technology.
Yeah.
So what do you think, is there any evidence to suggest what they were doing to actually catch fish?
We have very sparse evidence for Mesolithic fishing technology, really throughout all of Europe. I mean, in better preserved places in Scandinavia and Russia, we have fish hooks, and we have a few fish traps. Tend to come to the late Mesolithic. My colleague in Reading, Martin Bell, has got evidence for a fish trap down in the Severn Estuary now. We've got some in Ireland. We don't have good evidence from Western Scotland. Okay. I'm sure they are using big fish traps. This site of Fiskery Bay here where we've got really nice, quite a large sample of fish bones. It's in a small bay, and at the entrance to this, there's a we don't know how date goes back, but there's a post-medieval fish trap. So there's a wall across the entrance to the bay. So at high tide, fish can swim in. At low tide, they get trapped behind. And people would have gone and speared them and collect them in baskets. Now, I bet if you were to excavate that, you might find, it might have been washed out, but there would have been wooden structures below it. Because it seems a fairly simple technology, and I'm sure the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers would have been using fish traps like that in these sort of landscapes of these small inlets with narrow entrances. I can't prove that at the moment, but that's my feeling. The fish from fishery were things like wraith and cod and wrasse, and they're all inshore fish. So I think they're not going deep sea fishing at this time. They are probably spearing them, catching them online, using baskets and so forth. That's all we can say at the moment. The other obviously interesting hunting thing in terms of marine is obviously sea mammals as well. And I'm interested whether we have remains of seal at Rubha Port and Seilich in the bones. And on some of these elongated pebble tools, I suspect they may have been used to work seal hide, actually, the way Inuit do. And we've had a project trying to find in the crevices of those stone tools remains of seal DNA. Not successful so far. So I think that whole exploitation of the marine environment is really interesting, but we've got such limited evidence. So I'll hope there'll be more in the final
report. Since you mentioned beveled pebbles, or you didn't,
yes.
You mentioned elongated pebbles,
yes.
Some of which are beveled. These are a bit of a sort of type fossil for the late Mesolithic in Wales and southwest England. So I was intrigued to see you having them throughout your sequence.
Yes.
Are there beveled pebbles right in the early Mesolithic?
Yes, yes, indeed. These, yes, I mean, we're finding them throughout the sequence. These samples, so they're not as frequent down here. You know, from these early levels, we only got 16 of these pebble tools. You know, we got 56 from there. But they seem in a similar range as far as we can see. So these ones here, for instance, this one here, and this one, these come from the earliest levels. Really? These are some of the earliest tools we have.
But those looking from here, I see the middle one is beveled, but
this one
on the left doesn't seem to be.
No, it's polished, it's rounded, it's got long striations. I've yet to actually look. We've now got a complete catalogue of them. As you can imagine, when people are excavating, there's lots of stone pebbles here which have no signs of use or wear at all. I'm sure most of them have been actually collected and brought to the site to use as little wedges and weights and so forth. We've now got this typology of these elongated tools in various different shapes and sizes, parallel ones, converging ones, smooth surface, rough surface, and fragments. And what I've got to do is look at the correlation of wear patterns on these. Is there some that are distinctly beveled, some which are mainly flaked? And then we've got to try to work out whether that beveling is just from use or whether it's deliberately imposed. But we've got quite a good opportunity to look at this here. And like you, I was very pleased actually to find that we've got these pebble tools coming from those earliest levels. And of course we've got these interesting stones here as well. These come from the middle phases of the site, possibly actually phase 2, where there seems to be quite a large number of these large flat stones as part of site furniture. And we've got to look at these for wear traces to try to work out more carefully whether, again, what sort of use is occurring on these. But I think, like you, feel that this technology has been rather neglected in Mesolithic studies in favour of all the chipstone.
Good, thank you. That sounds really exciting.
But of course, the other thing that's missing is all the organic tools. I'm sure, these would have been a small component compared to those made out of wood and plant material and twine and so forth.
Thank you. Are there any further questions? Okay. Well, I think it just remains to thank our speaker for this evening once again for a fantastic lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed.
And to thank everyone for coming. Have a lovely rest of evening. Hopefully we'll see lots of you next month. So our lecture next month on February the 12th is Dr. James Wright, who will be presenting a lecture on he's searching for Britain's oldest pubs. So if we can tempt you back for that, we'll look forward to seeing you then. Thank you so much. Good evening.